Well, good morning, everybody. I'm sorry not be able to be there. I was also been enjoying the in-person meeting definitely more than the last couple years, but we're still getting pretty heavy snow coming here in Manhattan. So roads are not very good. So it was a challenge this morning earlier, and still it is now. I don't want to complain too much because obviously we do need the moisture as well. But one thing I just asked Jeff and Marcus as well, if you have questions, please stop me anytime and just raise your hand. They will stop me and ask questions. So I like to do that as much as possible as we go along. That's one of the things that's sometimes difficult when we're doing this Zoom, but I'll try to stop also every few slides and just make sure we have some questions and discussions. I think that's the main part of this presentation. So please don't hesitate to do that. Okay, so a few things that I'd like to discuss in the time we have today. Just touch a little bit on a few different things, and I'll touch on all corn, soybean, wheat primarily. But obviously, if you have any other question on sorghum or any of the nutrients that we're not touching right now, please again ask questions and make comments. But some of the things again on nitrogen, obviously the high fertilizer prices an issue. I was hoping prices will go down before the issue in Ukraine and Russia, but obviously now with the energy and uncertainty, and actually potassium maybe even becoming more of a challenge, and prices maybe actually keep going up, unfortunately. But again, what that means for us, we have to obviously make sure we're doing a good job in terms of management. There are some questions on role of additives. Can we maybe take advantage of some of those, and how we can improve efficiency? And I think that's really what we need to. We have to do what we can in the farm. Obviously, the prices are a little bit out of the or reach, and so we focus on what we can do. On the phosphorus side, I think there's a lot of things we can talk about there. Obviously, we do have the potential for drawdown options in situations where we do have good amounts of phosphorus already in the soil, and I think that's something we really need to consider this year. Again, a lot of these, given the high fertilizer prices and return to phosphorus. Other things, sulfur becoming more of an issue, especially some of you, depending on the soil types you have there, and pH. Again, is something that we need to pay attention to that. So I'll touch a little bit on that as well. And so one of the things I wanted to start with, and I show this pretty much during the winter meetings, is to put a little bit of in context this concept of economic optimum nitrogen versus what will be maximum agronomic nitrogen. Okay, and so this is I think something that we need to keep in mind, because obviously nitrogen is not free, right? If nitrogen is free, obviously we want to go after the maximum yield, which is what we have here, the maximum agronomic yield. This is actually a regression. This regression line is data from close to about 120 trials in Kansas. Okay, so you have yields, you have N rates. So this is your typical nitrogen response curve. Obviously, there's a lot of noise here. Okay, so we know that I'm not showing the data here, but there's a lot of noise when it comes to what's coming from the soil, organic matter, residual nitrogen. All of that is contributing to adding some of that noise. But anyways, going back to the concept of agronomic optimum and economic optimum, the economic optimum is really the rate that is at that point we're basically paying for that last pound of nitrogen. Okay, and this number is usually lower for sure. It's lower than the maximum agronomic, and how much low will typically depends on how expensive is nitrogen compared to grain, to corn, right? And so anyways, this is a good concept to keep in mind, because obviously this year, and always we want to go after the economic optimum, but this year the question is, do we need to be pulling back the rates some, as we are trying to be as close as possible to this economic optimum? And that's a good question, how much we should be cutting back nitrogen based on that price. And so one common way to do this is that we basically work with price ratios, and this is the ratio of a bushel of corn for a pound of nitrogen. And so the different lines that you see here is basically the different price scenarios, and that 12 basically means, again, very cheap nitrogen compared to corn. What we have here is net return, okay? And these are different rates of nitrogen, right? And so the red dots are basically here the maximum return to nitrogen that you're seeing, okay? So again, with the cheap nitrogen, obviously, we can put more nitrogen. You see here the maximum return is higher. And again, we can, obviously, we are getting more money overall, right? Right now, we are probably closer to this 5, right? This is the kind of the worst scenario where we've been in many years. And so we are in a situation where the price of nitrogen is high compared to corn. If you think about historic numbers, kind of average historic number, that ratio is probably somewhere around 7 to 8, somewhere around here. And so right now we are with that, again, essentially more expensive nitrogen, the maximum return and the optimal nitrogen rate is basically slightly lower. One thing that I wanted to emphasize here, and the reason why I showed this is because, again, we're chasing that economic optimum. We usually think we need to cut back significantly. In reality, we're not really talking about too much. In this case, we see that it's really less than 10% of the nitrogen rate that maybe we need to cut back as we're trying to chase that economic optimum. So in other words, if you were, you have your historic numbers that you've been using over the years, and you feel like you're pretty close to that economic optimum for your operation, and we're thinking about cutting back some, we really shouldn't be putting back more than 10%. Okay, so that's the one thing I want to emphasize in this case. So in reality, even with the price situation, again, it's not much what we need to cut. That's one thing. The other thing is that, if we cut too much, you see how steep this slope is. Okay, very quickly we're going to start to lose return here pretty significantly if we are too aggressive with cutting that nitrogen rate. So those are some of the key points I wanted to emphasize on these. And I'll pause there a little bit, and Jeff or Marcus, if there's any comments or questions at this point. Okay.
Sorry if that's what.
Yep.
Is it instead of 118 trials, is that dry land and irrigated both, or is it circles only?
Okay, on the 100, did you hear that, Dorivar? The 118 trials, is that dry land? Is that irrigated? Is it circles, or what is that?
Excellent point, and that's actually a combination of everything. Okay, so a combination of dry land and irrigated. I would say pretty heavily the eastern, central and eastern part of the state. We do have some western Kansas, but less. Most of that obviously is going to be irrigated. So that's a good point. And so the question is that how is that going to affect the shape of that response we're talking here? And in reality, that's usually not going to change very much. Okay, so the shape of this response curve tend to be similar. One of the things that's going to be very different is how much noise you tend to see here. Okay. And so a lot of that will depend, in dry land, we tend to have quite a bit of residual nitrogen, for example, in some years, and some of that may be contributing quite a bit of nitrogen, okay? And so in that case, the noise, you can have essentially, pretty good yields with no nitrogen in some situations, right? And that basically depends on what kind of residual nitrogen we have. But the general shape of response tend to be similar regardless of the whether it's dry land or irrigated. Good question. Any other comments, questions, please?
I think we're good.
Thank you. Thanks for asking that. And please, again, let's keep doing this. Stop me and make comments and questions. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to, we discussed this question about whether we need to cut back on rates, and I think it's pretty clear that if we do, it has to be small. Okay, we shouldn't be cutting too much. We have to be careful not to be too aggressive. Now the other question is, how can we improve efficiency of that nitrogen fertilizer? And I think to me this is maybe a more relevant question even than cutting back on rates. Is okay, let's evaluate the program that we have right now, and can we do a better job in terms of efficiency rather than cutting back on rates necessarily. And so this study, actually we have 9 locations last year. We're hoping to do the same this year, maybe have another 10 locations if possible. But this is basically corn yields, okay? Here and then different N rates, and again, this is your nitrogen response curve that similar to what we showed earlier. This is one location, so you see the dots here, basically showing the different rates. And this is basically using urea broadcast at planting, okay? And so then you can see here the red dot here. This is basically a different management, different application method using UAN and culture injected, okay? And so what you can see here is that, if you compare that point to the line here, we're basically increasing yields with the same rate of nitrogen, okay? So overall, with 120 pounds of nitrogen, you're getting higher yields, essentially something that would be equivalent to, in the range of 25, even up to 30 pounds of nitrogen, okay? So just by doing a better job at putting that nitrogen, and that could be, again, a combination of things like placement, timing, whether we are injecting that nitrogen and so on, all of those, that combination of things to do a better job with that nitrogen, improve that efficiency, and basically with the same rate of nitrogen, we are increasing that yield, that translating to efficiency, right? And so I think that's something we need to keep in mind, how efficient we are, how many bushels we are getting for every pound of nitrogen that we are putting out there. And I think that's something that we need to think about. And I know some of you do an excellent job already, very little room to keep improving, but there's always small tweaks that we can do and improve that efficiency. And so this is, again, obviously something that's going to change depending on the type of system, if we are no-till, conventional tillage. And so this is something that's going to vary a lot by region and by management. And so again, the most efficient system is really slightly different for each of you. And a lot of this will depend on your operation, right? And so just keep that in mind. There's basically no exact recipe for everybody, if you will. And so in this example here, we see that, just looking at that efficiency, again, different combination of placement, source, and time. And that efficiency component, if you look at that, we are seeing a higher efficiency compared to our baseline, which is the urea broadcast. We see higher efficiency with Coulter 2x2. In some cases, we have, stream UAN was basically similar. Broadcast urea and MBPT are similar. And so again, a lot of kind of differences here. And again, this will be different depending on the operation. But I think it's illustrate the opportunities that maybe we have there to keep improving efficiency and using that nitrogen well, minimizing losses and timing that nitrogen the best we can. Okay, so switching gears a little bit here, one of the things I wanted to spend a little more time is on this question of additives. And yes, we do have opportunities, I think, to use additives, and in some situations we can really benefit from it. So I think that's something to keep in mind. The question is obviously what kind of additives, which ones are going to provide some benefit, and that's where it gets pretty confusing because there are many products out there, and sometimes it's a little bit difficult to know what's working and what maybe is not working. This is urease inhibitors, and this is specifically for side-dress urea. I want to emphasize this. Okay, so side-dress urea obviously is a situation where you have urea sitting on the surface. If you have high temperature conditions and windy moisture in the soil, that obviously can drive some of that volatilization losses. And we do have products out there that have been around for many years, MBPT, agrotane type products that have been around for many years that we know works well. The key is usually, do we need it? and how we can take advantage of these. And that's where it becomes, and maybe sometimes difficult. You know, we've done these studies many times where, you know, we apply and then we got a rain or something the next 2 or 3 days, and obviously you don't see anything because you're incorporating that nitrogen that way. You know, if you were able to apply urea or UAN before the snow here, obviously that take care of the issue. Okay. And so again, just that's one of the challenges. But again, if we are not getting that moisture, we are not getting the ability to incorporate that nitrogen, that's where we have the problem. And so we just have to identify in what situations we need this type of products. And a few things, you know, on volatilization in particular. First of all, just want to remind, you know, we do need to have urea for that to happen. Obviously, by using UAN right there, we are basically cutting the potential for volatilization in half, because UAN is only 50% urea. And so the process that happens is that, you know, we're putting that urea, that conversion to ammonia. And during this transformation, this hydrolysis process is where we have the potential for losing some of that ammonia. Okay. And so if you have that urea sitting on the surface for too long, you start to have some volatilization problems. We have some environmental factors affecting this, obviously higher temperature, wind condition, and obviously, you know, urease, which is really kind of the driving component, and a lot of that basically comes from residue. So if you have heavy residue, that's also driving some volatilization, and obviously with heavy residue, you also have the potential for tie-up. So you have kind of that two combinations of things happening there. This year, I got a lot of questions about, again, top dressing, and I mentioned that a little bit already, but what happened in top dressing? Do we have potential for volatilization in top dress? And yes, we do have some, but obviously the amount of volatilization will tend to be much smaller. We did measure volatilization losses in urea that we apply in early February. We measured that for over a month, and we were, worst case scenario, we were able to measure up to about 20% volatilization during that 30 to 40 day time frame. Okay, worst case scenario. Obviously, in that situation, you know, we're not getting the snow, we're not getting the moisture. We basically stop at the time where we have moisture. We stop the study because that basically incorporate the urea. So again, there is potential, and I worry about, you know, a week or two ago, we have those temperatures of, you know, get to close to 80 degrees here. You know, that kind of things worries me. When you're putting urea and you have 80 degrees, well, that's not good. And so there is potential for that to happen. But again, it's still very small, and the worst case will tend to be for top dressing, side dressing summer crops, especially sorghum, which usually is going to be later. If there's any comments or questions on that, Jeff? Okay. Okay, the other one is, you know, nitrification inhibitors. No question. Yes.
We did have one.
So here on the one of the questions, okay, how much is that what I'm assuming 6 or 7 would be better for that.
Did you hear any of that?
I couldn't hear that.
He's asking if the pH has a factor on the volatilization.
Yeah, yeah, that's a key point, and yes, it typically will be high pH. So if you think about it, you know, just go back to this reaction here. What do you see here? You know, kind of that you need for that ammonia to go to ammonium is hydrogen, right? And so hydrogen obviously is in lower pH, below 7, you're going to have plenty of hydrogen. And so what happens if you have pH above 7, especially you get into about pH of 8, you're basically pretty small amount of hydrogen, free hydrogen around there. And so essentially in that case, you start to see more of that nitrogen stay in the ammonium form, and that's pushing more of the volatilization. So it's really an issue with high pH. And so guys out west, you know that they have pH of 8, 8.2, that kind of things. That's not good. But anything below 7, I wouldn't worry at all about it. Good question.
The other question I got is, say you're no-till on a circle, like urea, hot dress on corn versus UAN spread on UAN versus urea. Charge, but you're losing much efficiency with urea over the circuit and running the circuit pass versus percent, on a factor like 0.9 versus 1.2 on a dry spread versus urea or UAN. That makes sense.
I don't know if I can repeat that verbatim. But
You're more efficient, or you should be more efficient with your 28% versus urea, but the cost spread urea versus
so 28% versus urea,
yes.
the cost spread on that.
And so with a circle, no-till, you're gonna have your tie-up.
No-till circle, you're gonna have tie up in the residue.
Your factor of pounds nitrogen on bushel, is 0.9 versus 1.2 based on your fertilizer source.
Talking about the efficiency of the fertilizer source on like the 0.9 versus 1.2, depending on which fertilizer source. So with that spread in the price and the efficiencies, how much are you losing?
Okay, so difference in price, which one's more expensive? UAN, right?
Yeah.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And this UAN and urea, I will consider to be pretty comparable if we are doing a good job applying. Urea can be pretty efficient if we are, taking care of timing, if we have conditions for volatilization, if we're using an inhibitor. I don't have any concerns with that. And again, the timing wise. The other thing also tie-up, if you're comparing urea versus UAN, if we're using streamer bars with UAN, those are also pretty comparable. We've done a lot of studies there, and broadcast urea versus streamer bars UAN tie-up is basically not, very, very similar. We are minimizing tie-up problems there. So in other words, again, we can have very similar efficiency with both if we are kind of taking care of the potential issues with urea, which typically will be mostly the volatilization, okay? Because again, everything else we're kind of taking care of there with placement. And so that's a good point. It goes back to price, and I think that's obviously a huge factor. If we can do a good job with urea and it's cheaper, I think that's the way to go, in my opinion.
No, I was trying to memorize verbatim what you were saying, and then I got lost after 3 sentences.
I hope that was the question.
Yeah, that was it. Thank you, Dorivar. We got one more.
Yeah.
In February, they did a study on volatilization in February. What percent volatilization did they say they had?
Back in February, what percent volatilization did you have?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't have the data to show here, but worst case, in one location, we got to 20%, okay? And that was out of 6 locations, and that was one location we have 20%, and then most of them were actually pretty low. We have, I think, 5 to 6% is what we were able to measure in the other locations, but that's pretty much background levels. 5% is if you translate that into pounds, you put in 100 pounds, that's not affecting yields. And so, and that's again top dress in February. And I have to say that year we did have a few warm days, and that's what killed us, I think. Some years it's not uncommon to have 70, 75 degrees temperature in February, and that's what driving a lot of this. But it's still not too bad.
Anything else? How are you measuring that volatilization?
Yeah, that's pretty complex. We actually work with a micrometeorology colleague here, where we actually is in the field, completely in the field. So these real situations, nothing in the. This is not easy to measure, and that's why a lot of the data we have in the past has been in the lab, grow chambers and things like that. But we work with the micrometeorology colleague here to put sensors out in the field and field scale, obviously measuring wind, everything, and basically capturing the ammonia volatilization in the field. So this is all field conditions. Again, very, very complex, very difficult. I wouldn't be able to do it myself if it wasn't for the micrometeorology group.
Okay.
Good questions. Good questions. Please again stop me again if there's anything. We'll keep going here. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to just touch a little bit is nitrification inhibitor. You know, if we have a wet year, nitrification inhibitor basically what it's trying to do is keep the nitrogen in the ammonium form for as long as possible. As we know, nitrate is really what's risky, right? Nitrate can leach, we can have denitrification if we have wet conditions. So as long as the nitrogen is in the ammonium form, we know that's pretty stable. That's not mobile. The nitrate is the problem, right? And so the nitrification inhibitors basically is trying to delay that process of nitrification and keeping that nitrogen in the ammonium form for longer. So this is a study we've been doing a few years now, looking at nitrification inhibitor with anhydrous ammonia, 150 pounds, and we use NSERB, which is one of the, there are different new ones now. One that we've been testing as well is a newer version that obviously works well. So there's a few out there that has some pretty good research that shows that works. However, out of those 8 site years that we have there, we basically found that 3 of those we saw a yield response. Okay, and so what happened in the rest of the years? Obviously, what I would say is just we didn't have enough. We didn't have the conditions for nitrogen losses, and this is obviously the challenge. You know, if we know we are dealing with a field, you know, you have a field that is kind of problematic. You know, you usually have water standing, or perhaps it's pretty sandy, and those are maybe fields that are good candidates to use something like this, that where you know you may be going to be you know, having some potential losses. But most of our soils, fine texture soils, and again, especially because if we don't have excessive moisture, then we don't have the losses. And I think that's a challenge. But when we need it, yes, it does work. But again, out of those 8 site years, as you can see here, we have 3 positives. And obviously 19, 2 of those were in 19, and 19 was pretty wet year. And so just to put that in perspective. So again, just keep that in mind. Leaching and denitrification is really what we're going after in this case. Okay, one that we've been talking a lot about also is what about these products that basically provides maybe fixing nitrogen? And these are, there are a few out there in the market right now, and I think it's a lot of things going on, a lot of research, which is good. One of those is PivotBio, where we have actually 1 location, and we did have another one last year that we still need to summarize. The idea with this product is really that it's supposed to be live bacteria, essentially, that you apply in the rhizosphere, you know, either with the in-furrow or seed treatments, and basically fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, right? Just fix nitrogen and make it available to that corn. That's the idea. I have to say, I've been always pretty skeptical about these products, and so I want to admit that, but there's been some good research going on, and so that made me think that there may be something coming that maybe will make a difference for us. This is data from Manhattan, and this is nitrogen uptake in the whole plant, okay? Different rates of nitrogen here, and basically with and without proven, okay? PivotBio. And as you can see, there's a slightly increase basically that we saw in nitrogen uptake with the application of PivotBio. Very small, but there was a trend there. And again, remember, this is nitrogen uptake in the plant. However, when you look at yields, you know, there's nothing really clear in our data here for yields. And a few things, this is 2020, so this we tried this one. This was the version that's supposed to fix 30 pounds of nitrogen. I think there's a newer version now, and so we need more data. I want to emphasize that we don't have enough data. But what I see so far, it seems to me that, you know, whatever is doing, if it is doing something, is not enough to translate into yields. That's, I think, is the challenge at this point. They do have a lot of data from Iowa, from Illinois, and I talked to some of their agronomists, and one of the question to me, at least, is for me is you know, how is these things performing in our environment here in Kansas? You know, middle of the summer, July, high temperatures, and these supposed to be bacteria, right? And so there are a lot of moving parts still there. I mean, do we need to have some adjustment? Do we need to have something different from the Great Plains? Those are good questions that hopefully we'll answer as we go along. So again, there's something there. I like to keep an eye on this. If some of you are using, I encourage you to do some testing. You know, put some strips and see what you're seeing. We're just gonna have to start doing more trials and accumulating data. I think that's the key. Okay, so with that, I'd like to switch to phosphorus, unless there's anything else on nitrogen, Jeff. Okay. Okay, so we'll keep going on just switching a little bit on phosphorus, and you see in this graph many times. I like to show it, but again, it's a couple of messages here. One of the things I want to highlight is obviously relative yield, the typical response to phosphorus that you will expect to see. And we have the critical value. In this case, we have here that 20 part per million. And the key point here is that, you know, anything lower, obviously we do expect to see yield response, okay? And so keep that in mind. How are we, what kind of salt test level we have, and whether or not we expect to see yield benefits. And then we have, obviously, we are in the, you know, sufficient maintenance range with usually higher salt tests, above 20, 30, 35, depending on where you are. At that point, obviously, we don't have any potential for yield responses in the year of application. Now, again, if some of you are sitting here and you are, you know, 30, 35 or higher salt test P, well, that sounds pretty good this year. That means you have flexibility to perhaps, you know, cut back, maybe just put some starter. Those are things that you need to think about, obviously. A few things I want to emphasize here when I talk about salt tests, and I'll show you some data on corn, wheat, and soybeans. But when I talk about salt tests, I'm using melic-free, okay? And we use 0 to 6 inch sampling depth. And this is important because depending on the method, there could be differences, okay? And obviously differences in sampling depth as well. And so the kind of the default is usually 6 inches, and melic-free is the most common method usually for most labs. Okay, so we have again these two scenarios, sufficiency, which is again a situation where salt test values are low. In this case, basically application of fertilizer is required for every year, every crop. Otherwise, keep in mind, you're gonna be losing yields. And again, that's really the challenge there. And again, in the build and maintenance situation where salt test values are high, again, nutrient application is not required every year. And so again, that's pretty good news if you are in that situation today, okay? And so basically provide that flexibility for applications. And so one of the big question this year, obviously, okay, so at what point I'm getting my money back for that phosphorus fertilizer? And we can do this in different ways. What I choose to do here is I use a data set. This is data from last year, corn, okay? 12 locations, different salt test values, as you can see here. And this is returned to phosphorus application. And I use 60 pounds of P2O5 here, okay? And these were all broadcast applications, so that's important to keep in mind as well. Broadcast application, and I use this price here, $5.25 and about 90 cents P2O5, which I don't even know if that's the number anymore at this point. But anyways, that gives us an idea of at what point we basically break even with that 60 pounds of P2O5. And basically this data, again, this across 12 sites last year, show us that, you know, somewhere around that 17 part per million or so and below, we are making money with phosphorus in corn, okay? And this, again, want to emphasize, This is in the year of application. Okay, so this is assuming the next few weeks you apply phosphorus, harvesting, in the fall, are you getting your money back? One of the challenges, obviously, with phosphorus that's different is that, if you are sitting somewhere around 35 parts per million and you're still putting phosphorus, it's not really a loss, okay? Because that phosphorus is not going anywhere. You're not necessarily seeing that benefit this year. You can always use it next year. The next crop's gonna use it. And so again, it's not really a loss. So that's one thing that we have to emphasize. It's just a very expensive phosphorus to be applying this year if we have the flexibility to maybe use some of the reserve phosphorus we have in the soil. Okay, so that's basically the key point here. And so, earlier I showed you 20 parts per million critical value for the agronomic side. As we're thinking a little bit more on the economics, that number started to change a little bit, right? And we know there's a little bit of noise around that number anyways, okay? But for corn in particular, close to that 20, but slightly lower, maybe 17, 18 parts per million, break even for 60 pounds of P2O5. If you're following K-State recommendations, the recommendation obviously is going to be different depending on soil tests, anywhere from 70 pounds to as low as 15 pounds per acre. Okay, and so again, the economics again will be different depending on that recommendation. And this is really what I use 60 pounds because kind of thinking about a 200 bushel corn will remove somewhere around that 60 pounds of P2O5. The other question is, what about starter fertilizers? And at what point we're kind of getting our money back with starter fertilizers? And that's usually a little bit more difficult to estimate because we know there's a lot of benefit from starter fertilizers, not just the phosphorus, but we can maybe put micronutrients. We are getting the benefit of early establishment, early growth that may have other benefits as well. And so again, that's always a little bit of challenge there. But if we use this same data here, 12 sites, as you can see, in this range of 20 to 30 parts per million, we are getting a few bushels here, okay? And this is bushels per acre. I don't know, 2 or 3 bushel maybe that we are getting in this range. Would that pay for a few gallons of 1034O? And the answer is yes. That would be a situation where we can definitely get benefit, get the money back. And again, especially if we're thinking about putting zinc or putting something else, obviously we get that benefit with the starter fertilizer. So that's a range where I'll definitely consider a starter fertilizer, especially no-till systems. We know that we tend to benefit more from starter fertilizers in that kind of situation. Any comments or questions at this point, Jeff?
All right, we got a few questions.
Okay.
Is that for all crops?
Is that for all crops, what we're looking at?
This is specifically for corn. And again, this is based on the data of 12 sites last year.
Okay. Just wondering what the economic return would look like for soybeans if you have that data.
Yes, I'll show that next.
Are there any questions? Yeah.
What's the efficiency of the band versus broadcast?
Talk about the efficiency of band versus broadcast.
That's a very good point. And that's why I mentioned earlier, all of this data is using broadcast, okay? And, in the case of and this will depend a little bit on the crop. And that's the thing about placement. If we think about what crop's gonna benefit the most about placement, winter wheat, obviously on top of the list. If you can put it with the drill versus broadcast, it's gonna be a big difference. Then corn is gonna be next. Corn tends to be more responsive to banding that fertilizer, and soybean tends to be more flexible. And so it kind of depends a little bit on the crop. But ideally, if you have the capability to put phosphorus with the drill for winter wheat, I think that's really the best way to do it. But again, that's a key point because that's going to affect also essentially the response that we are seeing. Okay, and so again, if we are banding that phosphorus, obviously we're going to see more efficiency, and we can actually get benefit even with higher salt test phosphorus. Okay. Even if you are higher in salt test phosphorus, you can still see some yield benefit and get profits from that phosphorus fertilizer. So that will be the difference there. So in this case, it's all based on proteins. Good point.
Any other questions? We got one.
Does time of year or temperature affect soil sample results?
Does time of year or temperature affect soil sample results?
Yes, it does. Depends on the test. The one that will tend to be most affected is typically potassium, and that's kind of depends on. I mean, most of you guys usually still not have a lot of issues with potassium. I think we're getting there, but that's something that tends to vary a lot depending on the time of the year. pH is also something that can vary a little bit. One thing that, and I haven't looked into this much lately, and I all try to do that in the soil testing lab, but you know, when we have dry soils, when we have drought, that's a situation where we tend to see some issues, some differences in soil test. And so keep that in mind. If you're seeing some weird numbers in your results, it could be an artifact of the dry soils. Okay. And so we have long time with dry soils, we tend to see some changes, especially pH, potassium, and maybe a little bit in phosphorus as well. And so keep that in mind. If you're seeing some weird numbers, I will kind of look at that, maybe retest if you can. But if you are seeing something out of the place, that could be something due to the dry conditions we have.
Is it low or lower with drier soils?
Is it lower with the drier soils?
Yes, especially in the case of potassium, will tend to be lower. And again, it's as we have more cycling of nutrients, and a lot of that also related to the residue. Obviously, we have the moisture for some nutrients to get back from the residue in the soil. We are not seeing any of that. So that's part of the issue. In the case of pH, we actually tend to have higher because we tend to have accumulation of salts accumulating there because of evaporation, and we don't have any rain to move it. Good.
How does the Bray compare with the Malik for the phosphorus?
Actually, I think you have that slide here. So let me answer that here in a minute.
Okay. Are there any other questions before it moves on?
What's the best time of year to soil sample for next year?
What's the best time of year to soil sample for next year's crop?
Yeah, and I, you know, if I have to choose the best time, especially for all the nutrients, including potassium, I like to do it in the spring. I know that's probably not very popular because obviously pretty crazy time. You don't have a lot of time to make decisions. You want to have that information in the fall. I know that, but you know, when you're sampling right after the combine in the fall, you just don't have enough time for any of that nutrient to cycle back from the residue, and you tend to see typically slightly lower values. And so spring tend to be reflect more accurately what you really have in that soil coming in for that crop. But again, logistics is a big factor, so I'm aware of that. So we have to see what works best for us. Good question.
All right, I think you have covered everything, Dorivar. We'll let you keep going.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, starter fertilizers. And one of the things I mentioned earlier, the phosphorus, we focus a lot on phosphorus, but I just wanted to, and this is all irrigated corn, pretty good yielding corn. But just wanted to emphasize that, you know, we are getting benefit also from other things like nitrogen, and especially if we are, doing anhydrous ammonia, or if we are doing side dressing for the most part, you know, having some nitrogen with the starter has a lot of value. And so I think that's one thing we have to keep in mind. And so besides the phosphorus, we have the nitrogen. If we need micronutrients, and this is, you know, here's a blend of microbes that we apply in this study. We didn't see a response to the micronutrients, but you know, if we need zinc in particular, we do get that benefit from starter fertilizers. So anyways, just wanted to emphasize that you know, in the starter fertilizer obviously provide other benefits as well. Different placement methods, obviously we do have flexibility. One of the main differences in terms of response, they are pretty comparable. One of the main differences is really the rate, how much flexibility we have on rates. One that I like very much is the dribble on the surface because it gives you a lot of flexibility for rates. We actually put pretty high nitrogen rates with this and works pretty well. And you don't have to deal with the attachments that you need for the 2x2. In furrow, obviously pretty efficient, but just have to be careful with the rates. We cannot go up too high, and definitely not put any UAN with it because the urea part of the UAN is also will be toxic. And so again, that's a challenge with furrow. So if we are thinking about small amounts, furrow works perfect. We just are limited in the rates. Okay, so the question earlier was about soybeans, and so this exact same exercise. I have 21 locations in this data set, and this is 40. I'm sorry, this is not soybean. This is wheat. This is 40 pounds of P2O5 for wheat. Also, broadcast application. I mentioned earlier, this is a big factor here. If we are having this pan apply, this number is going to be very different. So where we are in this kind of sort of break-even point with the prices today, somewhere around 25 parts per million or so. Okay, so a few things here that is becoming pretty clear. First of all, the different crops have different critical value, if you will, for your soil test. Winter wheat basically need higher soil test. Corn, as we saw earlier, still pretty close to that 20, break even maybe 18 parts per million. We really need to have at least 25 parts per million in this case, especially to break even with phosphorus. The other thing I want to highlight in this graph, you see how much noise here, okay? A lot of noise here compared to that corn. And this is, again, in my opinion, has to do with the broadcast application component, okay? So the broadcast in wheat in particular. The other thing also in wheat is we know there's interaction between planting dates and response to phosphorus, okay? So if you are planting late, you tend to see usually better response to phosphorus compared to early planting. This has to do obviously with the tillers. If you are able to put any additional tillers in the fall and early spring, is benefiting that wheat crop. And so there's a little bit more complexity there, and we do tend to see more noise in the data for that reason, because you have the factors of placement and you have the factor of planting dates that interact with that response. But overall, we need higher soil test P to break even with that for wheat. And this is using 40 pounds of P2O5. Okay, so I'll show you the soybean here in a minute. And so one of the questions is, again, and I mentioned this already, if you have the possibility, you can basically, if you have high test phosphorus, you can skip application in a year. And that's something to think about. But what's going to be the effect? And that's on soil tests. And that's the question. And so keep this in mind. What's happening in terms of removal of phosphorus with the different crops? And again, these are, if you're looking at things like soybean, you're removing about 0.8 pounds of P2O5 per bushel, pretty high removal rates, especially high yielding soybeans. Corn, 0.33, 0.5 for winter wheat. And one thing that we can use, and again, these are a rule of thumb. So I mean, there's going to be noise here. There's going to be variability, but about 18 pounds of P2O5 is going to change soil test by about 1 part per million. Okay, and so if you use that number, and let's say let's use just for quick calculation here, 170 bushel corn, 56 pounds of P2O5, that's going to affect your soil test P by about 3 parts per million. Okay, so if you're not putting any phosphorus, you expect that there's going to be a drop in soil test. That's the point. And so how long can you do this? If you're not putting your phosphorus this year, how long you can do this will depend on what kind of soil test you have right now. You may be able to do it for, a year or two, maybe multiple years. Some guys that maybe have soil tests close to that, 50 part per million or so, you can do the numbers. You can go, multiple years without putting phosphorus. Maybe again, I still think starter fertilizer is a good idea in that situation, but you don't have to put the full amount necessary. And again, that looks pretty good in a year like this. However, again, just to emphasize, I like these calculations for a short term, but still you have to go back and soil test, okay? Because there's a lot of moving parts here, different soils, mineralization, cycling of that phosphorus. So we need to go back and soil test. Okay, the early question, what about Bray versus Melik? And this is basically the data here. Here, this is Bray and this is Melik 3. The line is basically 1-to-1, okay? And actually in our recommendation, we use Melik and Bray as the same, essentially, except if you have high soil test high pH, okay? If you have high pH above 7.4, you start to see some problems, okay? And what happened in that case is that Bray usually tends to underestimate phosphorus in those high pH soils. And so Melik will do a better job in that kind of situation. Most of you guys, I doubt you're gonna have a lot of those soils, except maybe parts of the fields and things like that. So Bray, I think, is a good way to go, okay? But that would be the only situation where I would worry about that. We have other tests, and this is really more for guys out west. Olsen, they use Olsen quite a bit because of the high pH. One that we've been looking more and more, we just adding more data, is the Haney test, which is a good test. And again, I'm just looking at the phosphorus component here, nothing else. But again, we do have the same issue that we see in Bray, basically in high pH soils. But anyways, again, to that question, Bray is a good option. Essentially 1-to-1 compared to Melik, except if you have high pH soils. In that case, I will consider Melik if possible. Okay, questions or anything, any comments at this point?
We're good.
Okay. Okay, so soybeans, what about soybeans? And this is data from 18 locations the last couple of years. And what you see here is basically response relative yield here, okay? And different soil test values, again, Melik 3, 6 inches. And what you see here is that, that critical value is about 17 part per million for soybeans. Anything below 17 part per million, you're seeing a drop in yields here, okay? So think about, again, what we talked about earlier, wheat is really higher, 25, corn is probably right around that 20, soybeans clearly critical value lower, 17 part per million. And so essentially soybean will tend to, you can get by with lower soil test phosphorus for soybean. Tends to be more efficient in terms of how you're using that, whatever is in the soil. So that's the key message here. The other things I wanted to highlight, and I showed this many times this year, I really like it because it's an example. I think we didn't do it on purpose, but I think it shows that, there are other limiting factors here. And this dots here is basically showing locations where we have soil test phosphorus, in this case at 50 part per million, 75 part per million, but look at the pH of 5.1, pH of 4.8, okay? So obviously your yield, relative yields is affected significantly here. So here the driving factor is no longer phosphorus. Here the driving factor is pH, okay? And so again, just to put in perspective there, I know this is a tough timing. I'll touch a little bit on that, but it's a difficult decision. It's a long-term investment. But again, we are using the fertility that we have out there, and we are taking advantage of that. Because we have the pH is out of the optimum range. And so again, if we are not keeping that pH where it should be, obviously we're not taking advantage of the nutrients. And we know that, and that's pretty basic. But I think this shows pretty nicely what happens. And again, we didn't do it on purpose, but I think it's a nice example. Okay, so we did the same thing. Early question also, what about that return to investment to soybeans? And this is using 45 pounds of P2O5, the same thing that I showed earlier for corn and wheat. And as you can see here, that break-even point is somewhere around 15 part per million, much lower than corn and definitely lower than wheat. Okay. However, the scales don't let this fool you. The scale is actually pretty good. If you have low testing phosphorus in soybean, return to investment, and again, this is in the year of application, so we're not thinking about any residual stuff. It's pretty good. Okay, so you can make pretty good money with phosphorus application in soybean if your soil test phosphorus is low. But again, that break-even point is lower. So in other words, again, we can get by with soybeans with lower soil test phosphorus before we really need to apply that fertilizer. Then again, obviously, again, this, as I mentioned earlier, if you are applying phosphorus, even in high testing phosphorus situation, we're not really losing technically this. We're not getting the money back this year, but it's gonna be there, okay? These are the numbers I use, which again, is, I don't know where we are in soybeans today. It seems they're changing every day. But anyways, that's a similar exercise as corn and wheat. Actual recommendations, again, if you follow K-State regs, gonna vary anywhere from 15 to about 55 pounds of P2O5 in this range. Okay, quickly here, I'll start switching to a couple other things I wanted to touch, and one of those is sulfur. You know, we, especially for you guys, I think in some situations you have the potential to see sulfur response, and there are really a couple driving factors. One of those is that we need to really pay attention to its texture and organic matter, and obviously the soil sulfur analysis, which are kind of three factors really determine whether or not we see a response. And this is basically two locations, irrigated locations, sandier soil, close to 40% sun, organic matter pretty low, actually not too bad to have 40% sun, but you know, it's still on the low side. And this is a different locations, low sun content, good organic matter, no response to sulfur. In this case, again, nice response to 15 pounds applied with the acetylsulfate with the UAN. Okay, so one of the challenges with sulfur is that it's not just the soil test sulfur. The soil test sulfur alone is actually, sometimes it's not a very good predictor. We really need to look at the texture as well. Typically, as we're getting definitely above 20%, close to 30 and higher soil test sun content, at that point, we'll start to see more potential response to sulfur. And that combined, obviously, again, we still have some value from the soil test sulfur, but again, it really, the texture is play a big factor here. Now, will this change? You know, we are seeing in some cases where we are seeing sulfur deficiency even in fine texture soils. And I think that's something I don't want to ignore that either, because, you know, in some cases, especially early in the season in corn, last year, I saw a lot of deficiency, sulfur deficiency in clay soils, you know, and a lot of those are gonna be low, perhaps because it's low in organic matter and it has some issues. But again, we're starting to see some issues in that kind of situation as well. But this is a data set we have from 20 sites last year where we really show that texture show up as one of the key factors. What about top dressing right now? And yes, that's, you know, we do tend to see more issues in wheat still for sulfur. And so again, we do have the potential there to apply now with the top dress. It could be ammonium sulfate, dry ammonium sulfate if you have that, or thiosulfate with the UAN. This is one example where you see nice response to top dress sulfur. And now the one thing with that is that, you know, the source make a big difference, and that also makes sulfur a little bit more complicated. Sometimes we do get we have different sources, and you know, we have thiosulfate, we have gypsum, which is obviously calcium sulfate. We do have a lot of other products like, you know, MESC, Micro Essentials, 40 Rock, that kind of products that actually already bring in some sulfur. And so we have a few options out there. And so timing, especially for top dressing, it has to be in that sulfate form to really see the benefit this year. However, I do know that many guys will actually use elemental sulfur, but they are applying on a regular basis, and they're basically planning on that elemental sulfur to be available within a year or so. Okay, so that's another option as well, and I really like that. You know, if you are thinking about elemental sulfur, which is cheaper, works great. The only thing is that we need to think that that's going to be potentially available the next year. So you need to plan ahead essentially on that if you're using elemental sulfur. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to touch is just on pH, just to touch that, because again, as you saw, that it's a key factor, especially for legumes like soybeans. This is a study, 2 locations with broadcast application on the surface, and this is no till, okay? So it was not incorporated, different rates of lime here. And this is the increase in pH that we're seeing here. And with a higher rate, an increase to close to about 2 units. And so we started with pH of 5, both locations. And we basically go to about 6.8, close to 7, you know, with the higher rates. The other thing is that, you know, the depth at which that pH is changing is only the upper 3 inches for no-till. So we're thinking no-till, surface apply lime, not incorporated. I mean, we're really just affecting the upper 3 inches. So that's, which is fine. In many cases, that's all we need really in pH and in no-till systems. And so just keep that in mind. But these have implications in terms of your rates, because if we are surface applying in no-till, basically we need to cut back the rate in half for lime, okay? Because we're not, you know, liming the entire profile, basically. What do we see in terms of yields? And we, these are 3 years that we did in these 2 locations, basically nothing. But we, again, and we know this, wheat tends to be pretty tolerant to low pH, especially some varieties. You can select for that, obviously. But then you get in corn and soybeans, and that's where we start to see the issues, okay? So if you're growing corn and soybean in the rotation, you see a response you start to see in corn, and definitely in the case of soybean, you need to up that lime rate higher. The other thing I want to emphasize in this, looking at this data, is that lime is really, we're talking a multi-year deal, okay? So how many years until you need to go back and apply lime? 8, 10 years or so, right? Depending on the soil. So it's really, we're talking multiple crops. And again, the economics is different for that reason. In other words, you are not getting your money back the first year. That's the challenge with lime, obviously. The other thing also is that, you know, in this case, I'm talking specifically about pH and potential for aluminum toxicity and so on. But we do have other factors. What about using your phosphorus more efficiently, using other nutrients more efficiently because of that pH, the chemistry affecting the chemistry of phosphorus and so on. So again, we do have other things that we need to keep in mind as well. Okay, and again, this is just some more examples where, you know, the different crops basically respond differently to pH. The most tolerant, obviously, is wheat, pretty much flat on range of pH. Milo, kind of in between, and soybean the most sensitive. We really want to be close to, you know, 6.4 or higher. Definitely, we get more than, you know, you get higher than 6. I think we are okay, but we need to be watching that closely. And the target rate will be, target pH will be to get close to about 6.4 or so in that range. Okay, pretty much all the things we talk about today. Again, go back to soil tests. Obviously, a year like this really pays to know what we have out there. If we do have extra, you know, phosphorus or any other nutrients, that's a good thing this year. And focus on what we need. That's the key point, right? And so again, I'm not gonna get too much into this, but just keep that in mind. And the other thing also, and I got a lot of questions this year, actually is interesting. A lot of guys who have access to some type of manure sources, excellent option, okay? So if you have the access to some source of manure, definitely a good alternative for especially phosphorus, potassium, micronutrients. You know, nitrogen sometimes a little bit more difficult to estimate availability. So sometimes I usually say, you know, still plan on putting fertilizer nitrogen, but definitely can take care of PK and micros. So again, that's one thing to consider. And obviously, again, the economics this year is different and can definitely pay for transportation and handling that manure if we have access to that. Again, micronutrients, we know that, and sometimes this is kind of the extra stuff we are getting with manure pretty much. Availability wise, again, nitrogen, sometimes a little bit difficult to estimate, and that varies quite a bit. But phosphorus is basically 100% plant available in the year of application, and the same for potassium. So those are the good ones that to me really has a lot of value. And so again, there are several things to think about. Obviously, it's a challenging year, but I also think there are opportunities. And so, grain prices are good, which means if we are able to be efficient with the inputs, I think we can take advantage of that. So I think we have to see it from that standpoint. In many cases, some of you maybe have some reserve nutrients that we can use and take advantage of that this year. Like I say, I was hoping that fertilizer prices will go down, but a lot of uncertainty right now again. So we'll see what happens. And with that, Jeff, I think I went over time a little bit, but we have some very good questions. I don't know if there's any more last comments or questions before we switch.
Are there any advantages to applying liquid lime versus dry?
That's a good question, and typically what I see there is that the liquid lime recommendation tends to be, and I don't know specifically what liquid lime we're talking about here. Is this liquid calcium or like from water treatment plants or?
Not sure.
Okay, there's a couple different things. Some people call liquid lime also to lime that's coming from water treatment plants, and those are pretty good quality lime, right? And so sometimes the challenge is how to apply, and it has to be dry and so on. But there are some products that call it liquid lime or liquid calcium. Those are low application, a few gallons per acre. The challenge with those is that it's not enough to really make a difference. And even with in-furrow application, and there have been some studies with in-furrow application, and again, remember the lime is not moving very much, and that's a challenge. Okay, so if you go back to this here, let's say if you are putting, first of all, if the rate is too low, that's not going to affect much, and then if you are banding that lime, that's going to stay only in small area. Okay. Compared to a broadcast, and in this case, this broadcast, up to three tons of effective calcium carbonate. So that's a challenge. The rate is not enough to usually make a difference.
Okay, I got another one here, maybe a few more. What is the buffer pH they had on the no-till situation, and how much will buffer pH change from year to year in soil moisture?
Yeah, buffer pH is actually will depend specifically on a key factors. Those are going to be the clay content and organic matter content, and so this is basically what's going to tell you what's the reserve acidity, and so that's not going to change very much because that's very specific to that soil. Again, texture and organic matter, and those are not going to change very much. That buffer capacity will tend to be pretty consistent. But this again, buffer capacity, we're talking effective CEC, right? The buffer pH is telling you what's in the reserve acidity. In other words, how much extra acidity you have in the exchange, in the organic matter and in the clay fractions. And that's really something that's going to depend on the soil. It shouldn't change very much because that's basically what's in the reserve, in the buffer capacity. That's the buffer pH. That reserve acidity. So that shouldn't change very much, but it will change depending on the soil. Some soils will not have a lot of reserve acidity, which means you don't need a lot of lime to increase pH. Some soils will have a lot of reserve acidity, which basically means that the buffer pH is going to be lower, which means you need much higher lime application to neutralize that, because you're neutralizing the pH, the acidity in the solution. There's going to be more acidity coming from the buffer fraction, right? So that's basically what you're trying to measure with the buffer pH. So there are two different things. One is the pH is measuring what's in solution. The buffer pH is measuring the reserve acidity, which is basically you need to know that to know how many pounds of lime you need to apply. That's really the goal. That's a good question because it is kind of confusing sometimes. We do get that report from the soil testing lab, and sometimes what's the buffer pH, right? So that's telling us how many pounds of lime, how many tons we need to apply.
What was the buffer pH on this slide specifically?
What was the buffer pH on this slide specifically?
Oh man, I don't have the numbers. So It's a good question. I don't have it. No, sorry, I don't have that on this.
Any other questions?
What was the time frame?
What was the time frame on that?
Great question. And this was this we apply after wheat harvest in the summer, and so summer followed there. We didn't do anything, and then the next year we basically came back with corn. And so the data that you see here, no, actually we came back with wheat after that in the fall, and so we follow wheat, corn, soybean in that order. And so we basically planted wheat. The first crop after the lime application was, I don't know, at least I guess 4 or 5 months. And then the sampling here that you're seeing here was after 3 years. Okay. And so how long it takes for the reaction to happen, I usually say at least 3 months, but a lot of this will depend on moisture. Okay. So remember, you need to have moisture for that reaction to happen. And so if you have decent moisture, 3 months is plenty. Oftentimes it will take more. You know, if it is dry, that lime is just sitting there. It's not doing anything. So it's really going to be a factor of moisture. Now, one question I got actually last week was, what's the best time? Should I be putting that lime in the fall or in the spring? And I usually say, you know, I'd rather have that lime apply. Even if you be applying in the spring now, you say, you know, I'm not going to have enough time for that lime for the reaction to happen. I still think it's better to go ahead and apply if we do have the logistics line up and we can do it. That's more important.